Thank you, Dennis. The first time I ever came to Honolulu, it was to visit this church a few weeks before I was going to come here and fill the august position of 10-month, half-time, temporary contract minister. If I recall, when I arrived, there was actually a little whiteboard welcoming me with something approximating those words. But before I ever got to see you all, I had a flight from the west coast of the continent to contend with. It was one of the longer flights of my short life, and though now it's only a portion, a segment of travel for me, but Bill Scarvey met me at the airport to take me to a home in Kailua of two past members who put me up for that long weekend. And as Bill drove me from the airport, we entered a 10-lane highway, and I was a little surprised. I wondered if the roads would be rudimentary here, or at least limited to at least 6 lanes. And to my right, I saw downtown, and its glittering lights and the tall buildings there, like Dennis just sang about. Bill might have explained then that the people are sometimes surprised by the cityness of Honolulu, or at least part of it. And something in me was a little disappointed by what I was seeing, to be totally honest. But flash forward 4 years, tens of thousands of miles traveled since, and my most recent trip across half of the largest ocean on the face of the earth, and feeling an airplane incline its nose toward this tiny speck in an ocean and seeing the glow of those city lights is just magical to me now, like a surprise, like a gift. And Dennis's gift of that song to us today was the first, well really the second instance of live music from Dennis to all of us in the sanctuary in all these many months. And it was a special gift to me because I've spent the last few weeks traveling around the continent, catching up with old friends, sitting in railway stations, getting my ticket for my destination more than once, and reading and doing a lot, well, not a whole lot actually. My travels landed me first in a wonderful celebration of my parents, in my parents' new housing community. I just can't wait to turn 55. It will be worth it just for access to their recreation center. Then we all sweltered a bit in 108-degree weather in the Tacoma, Washington area when my air conditioning in my Airbnb conked out. And we did get in a taco night with Troy and Mauricio, who send their fondest love to all. They live just a few miles from my sister now. And I met a Cocker Spaniel named Charlie, who has the world's most perfect belly to rub, in case anyone was wondering. I fell in a boat on the Willamette River and got a contusion on my arm that lasted for 2 weeks. Also, Dero Farrar says hi to everyone. We had a 3-hour brunch one day. Just why not? I told you I was trying to relax, everyone. I swam across my family's lake and back and got in a little trouble from my older cousins for not following the lake rules of having someone follow me in a kayak or a canoe. I'm still working on rule following, everyone. And some other cousins and I ran up a bill at a New York City vegan restaurant that I didn't think was possible, only vegetables could make, but everything's possible in New York City. It was glorious. Then I boarded a plane back here to Honolulu. But I struggle with saying I boarded a plane back home. The theme for this month is home. And in our opening song, the great Simon and Garfunkel capture that feeling of returning home, of the journeying we take to get back to where we are safe, where we feel the warmth of love or life surround us. So in a sense, when I travel back to Honolulu, to this community I love, to the kindness of my friends who are my adopted family here, I do have this sense I am traveling home, and yet I do not feel comfortable calling this my home. In the song we will all sing at the end of the service and after many other services, Hawaii Aloha, written by the missionary Lorenzo Lyons, the word used for home in English is home in Olelo, Hawaii. I did some research to discover whether this word, both a cognate and homonym, was borrowed from English. Kahu Loko Olu of the Hawaiian Church of the Hawaii helped me locate the first use of this word in these lands where it could be verified, and it was in a Hawaiian language newspaper discussing the purchases of lands in 1834. He explained his own understanding, and I quote, that the concept of home was introduced around the same time as the English language was being taught here. We also located a dictionary which was published in 1922, but traces its beginnings to an earlier 1836 version that contains home as home or place of family residence. So it looks like around those 1830s this was coming around. Interestingly, and according to a recent movement by many to excise some of these borrowed words from Alelo Hawaii, a more recent dictionary of the language, home does not appear as a word in the dictionary. Kauhale, or group of buildings, kau meaning group, hale meaning building. House or building is a more accurate meaning, however, so that this is sometimes used for home for some people. But the entry in this dictionary, Kauhale, goes on to explain the etymology, that in Hawaii, during settlement times, it was common to group buildings for various reasons, not the least of which was that women and men could not eat in the same place. So in order for everyone to eat, people needed at least two structures. Then there were also special religious protocols, or kapu, concerning times when different people must be separated from the wider group, which necessitated more structures, and so on and so on. So in some ways, the religious needs worked alongside the very human needs of the people to form the architecture or arrangement of their home. Sound familiar to anyone? Now, respectfully speaking, a religious historian or sociologist might wonder whether thousands of years ago the women just wanted some peace and quiet for a few hours and decided that the men would eat somewhere else. And then later, the kapu arose to give the religious faith or meaning this requirement. But however it worked out, however history saw fit, the places that the original human inhabitants of these lands called home were often a collection of structures and houses. And yet many of us, I think, are left with wondering whether it is right, whether it is acceptable to call where we live here our home. Why do you think that is? I have some theories myself, which you're about to hear, and they come from an idea that might arise from the ethics and the history of how land worked here on this island before the arrival of any settlers, and it has to do with ownership. It was John Van Dyke's book, or in John Van Dyke's book, Who Owns the Crown Lands of Hawaii, standard reading for anyone studying property law in these lands, Professor Van Dyke explains, and I quote, that before continuous contact with Westerners began in 1778, the dominant system of land tenure was an intricate and interdependent arrangement based on agricultural need and hierarchical structure. Individuals lived in reciprocity with the aina, or land, which they believed would sustain them if properly respected and cared for. Aina was not a commodity and could not be owned or traded. Instead, it belonged to the akua, gods and goddesses, and the ali'i, the chiefs and the chiefesses, who were the human embodiment of the akua, were responsible for assisting kapo'e Hawaii, the people of Hawaii, in proper management of the aina. The aina was not a commodity to be owned or traded because such actions would disgrace or debase one's family or oneself. When I read this, there was something in my own feelings about living here that starts to make sense to me. It is the possessive nature of saying my home. It's not that different from the feeling some have recently shared with me in stating gender pronouns, the possessive his or theirs or hers. Some have replaced with ours, or simply omit the possessive form of pronoun as you see in many people's names these days. And listen to this sentence again. The Aina was not a commodity to be owned or traded because such actions would disgrace or debase one's family or oneself. Those are powerful words. Most of us don't spend a lot of time wondering anymore whether what we will do might debase us or our families. I mean, I'm not in my 20s anymore, thank heavens. But this concept of property, of ownership, was entirely at odds with the way the missionaries arriving these lands and the governments that would shortly follow understood property and the law. In Western thinking, the very basis of property law is not so much the right to improve, change, mine, or otherwise work with the land. Rights to improve land are rights that flow with various kinds of tenancies on land, whether it's renting or leasing. The real test of ownership in Western legal thought is really the right to what? Anyone? To exclude, to evict, or to toss out. It is the right that most often involves the mechanisms of police, of courts, and of force to prevent or exclude persons from property. That's really the measure of who owns what. So along with saying something is mine comes the right or the privilege to prevent someone from touching, taking, or treading upon it. And this very concept is taken to extremes in states on the continent that have castle or domain statutes, which mean that a property owner can more or less shoot someone on the property they claim is their own without fear of retribution from the law or really from their society. I doubt very much if I asked you to tell me what comes to mind when I ask you what home means to you, whether you think to say a place you can keep others away from by lethal force, but in the Western way of thinking, at its root, that is a silent but ever-present attribute of what a home, what property, what owning land means. But I know that's not all it is. I know I can be a little extreme sometimes. After all, we've heard our whole lives that home is what? Home is where the heart is. Anywhere I hang my hat is home, to quote country music. Or you had the power to go home all along, Dorothy. Home is a people, not a place. Home is a feeling for many of us, not a structure. Now I realize I'm sort of quoting the wall-hanging section of a Ross's or a Bed Bath & Beyond here, because the number of aphorisms and the corniness with which those aphorisms are delivered stand in sharp contrast to the very real meaning of possessing and owning land. In some ways, there might not be a more conflicted concept for some of us, especially in these lands, than the concept of home, of claiming a place of meaning and security for ourselves. Now, just for fun, because we're doing Grammar Day, I took a look at what a more recent English dictionary has to say about home. And though it was not the only definition, the first, and what I kind of think of as the most charming definition of home, is the place you live permanently. And this makes sense in some ways. I'm sure we've all filled out forms that call for a permanent residence. What's your permanent address? I'm sure the Buddhists among us are getting a good chuckle out of the idea of a permanent home, or really a permanent anything. I don't think many of the people who live in houses on the shores of this island, who have watched the stretch of beach in front of their homes over the past few decades recede and recede and recede so that waters approach their doors, would argue all too mightily that a home, or at least a house, is permanent. Many just sitting here in this service have been here long enough to see Waikiki Beach shrink to a fraction of itself over the past decades. An article in Honolulu Magazine from 2018 reported that the Waikiki beaches are shrinking at an average of about a foot a year. It makes one wonder whether there is anything more impermanent than home than permanent. And among the teachings of science, of faith, and of law about the permanence of home are the teachings of the traditions of this faith, of Unitarian Universalism, regarding what is and what is not a real home. In 1841, the Unitarian minister Theodore Parker, who coined the often quoted phrase by Dr. King about the arc of the moral universe, delivered a sermon at the ordination of a colleague called "The Transient and the Permanent in Christianity." I always like to mention when I'm quoting something I was required to read to be approved for ordination in this faith, and that sermon, which was printed really like a booklet, was one of them. So if you think I preach long, some sermons are actually books. You should have been around in the mid-19th century. The sermon makes this point, that the doctrines of one of our parent faiths, Christianity, changed by the decade, by the century, over and over, kept changing these doctrines like so much sand receding into an ocean, so that the doctrines of that church, that faith, that spiritual home for so many, could not in all honesty and in good faith be viewed as permanent at all. His kind word for these beliefs, these teachings that changed from denomination to denomination, from decade to decade, was that they were transient. He wasn't saying they were bad, just that they were transient. And the sermon ends with a discussion of what instead is permanent, as he saw it in that father, that daughter, that mother faith of Christianity. Parker speaks of Christ in this way: the truths he taught, the doctrines respecting man and God, the relation between man and man and God, and the duties that grow out of that relation are always the same and can never change till man ceases to be man and creation vanishes into nothing. For it is not so much by the Christ who lived so blameless and beautiful 18 centuries ago that we are saved directly, but by the Christ we form in our hearts and live out in our daily life, that we save ourselves, God working with us both to will and to do. And finally, most importantly, God sends us a real religious life. God sent to us a real religious life, which shall pluck blindness out of the heart and make us better fathers, mothers, and children, a religious life that shall go with us where we go and make every home the house of God, every act acceptable as prayer. Parker first spoke these words in 1841, just a few years after the English language was introduced to these lands and started to change and teach the Western concept of home. But the permanence he speaks of about home is not the permanence of land and structures. It is the permanence of home that goes with us wherever we go. It is not the permanence of an address or a deed to land. It is the permanence of deeds of action that might be a prayer in itself. It is not the permanence of doctrine. It is the permanence of a religious life. On that same flight, on that first flight I ever took here to Hawaii, for some reason, the cabin flight attendant kept saying, "We're on our way to paradise. Are you ready to go to paradise?" That's a big question for a religious person. I knew what the attendant meant. They did not mean, "Are we ready to die?" But it's not the farthest thing from one's mind when you're boarding a flight across an ocean. That stark reminder of the impermanence of life, of the transience of our very mortal being, has stayed with me. I keep wondering whenever I board a flight back to Hawaii if someone's going to say that again. And every time I board a flight across this blue ocean back to this island, I remember that life is a temporary contract signed the day we are born, whose terms are written as we make choice after choice, living the adventure we are given to live until we reach the end. Until perhaps we return to what is truly, what is really the only home our lives may ever know. Call it the combined energies of all matter, call it space-time, call it God, but each of us on this glorious little marble in space are bound now to one another in this community, for religion actually means to rebind again. We are bound now to the deeds we hope will make real and lasting change for us and others, for deeds are perhaps the finest of all prayers. We are bound for glory, we are bound for peace, we are bound for rest in the sweet by and by, as we heard in the reading, For we are each, every one of us, on this journey of a lifetime. And that journey will take us to new places physically, emotionally, and spiritually in the coming months even. We will be discussing the next phase in our journey together here in this hallé, this building, and how we can stay bound together on this journey while every one of us remains safe and healthy. For isn't compassion something a home should hold? And in the coming months, I ask us to consider that if we are speaking at times about our being a guest in these lands, in statements that open many of our meetings, many of our gatherings, that we might make our deeds even more clear in supporting the flourishing of our hosts, the Kako'oe, Hawaii, and the Ainu. For isn't justice something a home should hold? And in the coming months, we will also be working with Dr. Michelle to reimagine a place where all people, no matter their age, no matter their abilities, no matter their attention, interests, or durations, can remain bound together in the way our community gathers and learns on Sundays and throughout the weeks ahead in boundless new ways of celebrating together. For isn't joy something a church, a home should hold? It is. It is. It is. These are some of the most exciting times this beautiful community has ever faced. And we will face these times together. With our hearts fixed on our destination, compassion bound, with our deeds fixed on our destination, justice bound, and our spirits fixed on our destination, joy bound. Adjust your seats and tray tables, friends, because one way or another, we are all homeward bound. And may it ever be so. Blessed be, and amen.